Hello. Welcome to this discussion of the recent negotiations, strike, and settlement involving the Writers Guild and the major studios. I'm Harry Katz. I serve as a professor of labor relations at the ILR School. I also direct the Scheinman Institute on Conflict Resolution. I'm really pleased today to be joined by Ellen Stutzman, who was and still is the lead negotiator for the Writers Guild. She's the assistant executive director of the Writers Guild, and we're especially proud of the fact that she's a graduate of the ILR School. I'm joined in this discussion with my colleague, Seth Litwin, who teaches, as I do, at the ILR School. Adam's an expert on technology and work, and he wrote a very interesting opinion piece that appeared on the front pages of the New York Times a couple of weeks ago about the implications of the settlement involving the Writers Guild. You're welcome to ask questions that we'll try and incorporate into our discussion. You can do so at any point by using the chat function. So let's get into it. Ellen, could you briefly summarize what are the key gains the writers won in their recent strike?
Sure. And let me just say thank you for having me. It's great to be back virtually at the ILR School. I would say that the gains that we saw in this contract, what's unique about it is they span our entire membership. And that was kind of a key feature of the strike. For television writers, we were successful in establishing minimum staff size requirements for television shows, as well as requirements about the amount of time writers have to do their work and have to be employed for, as well as carrying them through production. For our screenwriter members, we negotiated required a mandatory two-step deal, which is something that screenwriters have wanted for a long time. For our writers of shows like late night shows, quiz and audience shows, we were able to establish minimums and improvements for streaming. And then we also negotiated improvements in residuals for programs made for streaming shows, as well as the introduction of a first of its kind bonus for the successful programs on that platform. And then across our membership, we negotiated protections against artificial intelligence.
So could you tell us a little bit more about the last issue you raised? There's been mention in the press that the writers apparently won the right to be involved in and how to influence, that they have some new influence over how AI will be used. Can you explain what that involvement entails?
Sure. And just as a bit of background, artificial intelligence really up until a year ago was not something that was on our radar. And then obviously the introduction of ChatGPT raised some concerns because writers became aware that their work was, in those systems, and they view it and have called it plagiarism machine. And so we went into this negotiation, saying that artificial intelligence, it can't write or rewrite. It shouldn't affect a writer's credits or compensation. And in the round of bargaining that happened before the strike, the companies refused to talk about artificial intelligence at all until the final weekend, where they offered to say, we'll confirm that artificial intelligence is not a human writer. And that obviously wasn't enough. What we came out of it with was most of what we went in asking, but we really negotiated several pages of contract language that, again, artificial intelligence, will not affect a writer's compensation or credit. AI can't write or rewrite. And a writer is not required to use artificial intelligence. They may, if they want to, and it follows company policies, but it basically keeps AI-generated written material out of, our work.
Well, thanks for that clarification. Adam, what's so important about the gains achieved by the Writers Guild?
Well, Ellen's point that the AMPTP didn't want to discuss artificial intelligence, They really don't have to, and in fact, that response is actually the one that managements have typically taken over the years with respect to technological change. Technological change is really one of those topics that falls under management rights. Mm-hmm. Management does have to discuss the extent to which technological change might impact terms and conditions of employment. But management really does have the right to unilaterally decide whatever technology it is it wants to use. However, management doesn't have to do that. And I would argue here that by the writers really pressing on this, they not only ended up benefiting themselves, I think they'll benefit the studios as well. And I actually think it sets a really great precedent for other labor negotiations. If management's not willing to discuss how the technology will be used, the conditions around how it will be configured, the limits to its use, then all the parties can do is sort of just decide how the pie is going to be sliced up, right? They can't actually decide, like, how do we want to use technology to create value? And that's where I think this could have some big implications for some other labor negotiations. Mm-hmm. That is, will we really be in a situation where other labor negotiators can say, no, like, let's take a look at what the writers did. Let's actually discuss how we can use this technology most effectively, not just how we're going to split up the pie.
Adam, you were mentioning to me that to think of the studios as a monolithic block is inaccurate, that there's likely to be differences in not only among the studios, but between the studios and new entrants. Can you explain that? Some complexity on the management side in this process?
Well, I mean, there's always this matter of intra-organizational bargaining that we teach our students. I mean, so much of what we focus on is on the negotiations between labor and management. But labor relations, folks like to say, behind every good agreement, there's actually three agreements. There's the one that we are all examining now, but then there are also the sort of disagreements that happen within the labor side and within the management side. And I think Ellen probably has a really good sense of sort of the daylight that existed between the so-called legacy studios in the AMPTP and then the newcomers, because it seems to me like they have some real different interests. I mean, the studios are by and large in the business of producing and marketing content, and some of the newer players are much more much more about, Apple and Netflix are much more tech companies as I see them. But I'd be interested to know what Ellen thinks is sort of the daylight that comes between the member organizations in the AMPTP.
Yeah, well, a little bit of background on the AMPTP. It's an organization that has existed for about 40 years. And historically, it's just been the studios. In the last few years, streamers, Netflix, Amazon, and Apple joined. And the organization was formed to stop strikes in this industry. And it was relatively successful for a long period of time. From the 80s on, the only strike the industry endured was the writers' strike in 2007. And so it's an organization that operates on consensus, and I think when you're not facing a strike, that's much easier to achieve. What happened when we went on strike and then SAG-AFTRA, it became clear that there was a lot of internal dissension. Companies, obviously, that wanted to take a harder line and never agree to the things that they ended up agreeing to with us. But ultimately, companies like, Disney, Warner Brothers, Comcast, who have a fall season that they've just lost. I mean, they've lost the entire season. They'll hopefully get stuff up in January. Had to come in and make a deal. And I think, post these two strikes, a lot of those companies have to look at this situation and really wonder how effective it is to tie yourself to 7 other companies who may be fine having a strike last for much longer.
So Ellen, the press reported that, I guess in the final stage of the negotiations, that a couple of the key top large the CEOs of the large studios came in, and then the deal was made. Were they essential to the deal? What was going on there? Why do we have to have the CEOs suddenly appear at the end in order to get a settlement?
Yeah, they were essential. They have this organization that they delegate bargaining to, but our experience with the AMPTP is it has an ideological approach to labor, which is that it wants to give up nothing. And, I think the companies let that go on, but after a certain period of time, and this was expressed to us by CEOs that, you just have to make the deal. We have to have people back to work. And it required, the executives of those companies getting involved. And, it's their workers, it's their workforce, it's their work, engaging and helping to bring it to a resolution. And it was necessary.
So there was this new phrase that I heard mentioned, and I'm not an expert in this sector, and maybe either Ellen, you or Adam can help me understand it. There was this mention of mini rooms, and there was some discussion about that. And what are they, and why was the Guild so focused on trying to affect the influence they had on pay and other work conditions?
Yeah. So this is used in television. Mm-hmm. Television has always been a writer's medium. It's really controlled by writers because of the ongoing story over a season and over many seasons. And historically, writing and production happened and overlapped. And because broadcast and even cable ran on a regular schedule, there was sort of a time crunch to do work, or you had to, do it all over about 40 weeks. With the rise of streaming, where there aren't seasons, companies can take years between seasons. They started to separate writing and production, and use this term mini room to have all the writing done before production. And so for our members, it was a speed up. All of a sudden, work that would be done over 40 weeks now had to be done in 10 or 15. And most of the writers would be let go, and then a showrunner and maybe another writer would be left to do all the writing work during production, which happens ongoing. And so writers were all of a sudden going from working 40 weeks on a show to only 10 or 15 at Guild minimum. It just, started to become like the profession wasn't going to be viable. So what we did in the contract is we have allowed what we're calling, development or pre-greenlight rooms, but there's a significant premium. There's a 25% premium on minimums that if you want to employ writers in that capacity. Otherwise, it's more incentivizing the companies to go back to a model of taking the appropriate amount of time to do writing, having writing overlap with production.
So what I find fascinating about mini rooms and about the negotiation around this point is the extent to which this negotiation is actually a modern day version of something we've been talking about for a long time. Critics of unions will often say, they want to push mandatory staffing ratios, and they want to push mandatory employment duration minima, things like that. And the example they often give has to do with union workers watching other workers fix a manhole cover or something very old school like that. What's really interesting to me about this example is this is a modern example whereby management was very much trying to essentially reduce staffing ratios, right? And sort of make it seem as though this made a lot of sense. But ultimately, it was about really sort of squeezing workers more than they had been. And individual writers felt like they had to tolerate it because there are lots of people that want to be able to do that work. And so it seemed like they were getting squeezed more and more.
So it's a modern version of a speed up.
Exactly. Just as Ellen said. Exactly. And so that, to me, is what's so fascinating about it. The other point is, I think that a lot of people, when they read the news, they understand sort of the very basics of supply and demand, and they think, supply and demand, that should determine the outcomes that are sort of ultimately best for the world. Well, one thing that the writing room system does really well is it provides training, and it provides mentorship, and ultimately it ensures that there's this steady pipeline of folks that are able to move up from production assistants into writer roles, ultimately into head writer roles, and then into showrunner roles. And this essentially fixes a market failure. No individual studio would want to pay for what we think of as general training, for training that makes workers potentially more productive for every other employer in the system. But the union was this, and remains now, this institution that can help solve this market failure. And so in class, I like to use as again, a very modern day example of unions actually solving a problem that markets alone cannot solve.
So just to push a little bit on that, Ellen. So why didn't the studios see that? Why didn't they see those kinds of problems and try and work out a joint solution even before you get to the bargaining table? Why do you have to have a fight over that kind of issue when it seems to serve the interest, the long run interests of the studio, as well as obviously the interests of the employees?
Yeah, that's a really good question. One to ask the companies. I will say in television, and the Writers Guild is a little bit unique. You mentioned a showrunner who is the head writer of a show. They're our member, but they are management. And they are given control of a television show. And I think what we have found is that, because it's their passion, and they're sort of willing to make it work and make it work on the writing aspect of it. And it just wasn't working outside of the collective bargaining agreement. I think showrunners were trying to help. And what we were hearing is, people were saying, I need more writers, I need more time. And the companies just being unwilling and not, I guess, realizing the value of why writers need to be around, a little short-sighted. So it just became necessary for the union to do it. I think it's newer companies that brought on this model who are not as steeped in understanding how television production worked. And so that was just inexperience.
That was my exact question. I wanted to know, was it the legacy companies that always or traditionally understood the value of writers' rooms? And so my question was it these new players that came along and said, well, why are we paying for this? This isn't something that we benefit from.
Yeah, I think it was, things that started at Netflix and Amazon, but then they creep into all the traditional companies who have streaming platforms, and they all sort of end up having the same policies and practices. But I mean, when we got to discussions with the CEOs, they had understood, and really outside of the labor relations folks, business affairs, creative executives, a lot of people had expressed an understanding that the companies had kind of broken the business. Right. And that's, I think, why the strike was so widely supported across the industry, because there was a real recognition that they were ruining the business. And
even this is a technological issue, I think, because the streaming model is different than the broadcast model, right? So it's not that Netflix and Amazon are just evil, right? It's a different revenue model, and one for which it just didn't seem as obvious to them that it made sense to maintain that writer's room.
Right. Yeah, I think that's right.
So I have some questions about what's going to happen when disputes arise during the life of this agreement, whether those disputes are about the AI technology in some rather new language, and proposing, as you described it, that writers will have some say and involvement in how the technology is used. But even in issues around the mini room or other matters, is it that disputes will get solved through the traditional means of the grievance procedure? People can file a complaint about it, or have you also set in motion some mechanism for labor and management to discuss these issues as they're evolving? Because they're so new and so uncertain. Are there processes that are set in motion? Maybe there are processes that existed in the past that just weren't working, or maybe you've created new processes, again, for discussion on an ongoing basis to sort of problem solve over issues, rather than either have them, boil up and be issues that are postponed till the next contract negotiation, or issues that just get addressed through the grievance procedure.
Yeah. Well, on artificial intelligence, we did add language that the companies will agree to meet with the Guild semi-annually to discuss the development of the technology and how the companies are implementing it. Because for the most part, we were negotiating over something that's prospective. The companies were not using artificial intelligence in the screenplay process before the strike. And so it is something that will evolve and will be a major area of focus. For the rest of the language, we have a process where we do try and resolve issues prior to arbitration, sort of informal discussions in a grievance
Do you meet
process.
on a regular basis, or just you raise an issue and say, hey, look, we have a problem here, let's try and address it rather than have a fight over it later or something like that?
Right. Yeah, we raise them as they develop. And I will say the companies are they're sort of resistant to resolving issues prior to an arbitration process. I mean, we may settle, but we usually have to go through the process of actually, filing a complaint and setting a hearing date and getting to an actual close to an arbitration in order to incentivize settlement.
Do you think that attitude may change given how long a strike it's been and how costly this strike has been to the studios, as you mentioned before? I mean, do you perceive any new inclination on the part of the studios to say, hey, look, let's try and solve these problems before they come to us as issues in a contract negotiation?
I hope so. I would say anecdotally, as writers go back to work and are just dealing with the companies in their own deals, that there is more of an acknowledgement that this was the companies were at fault for how long this went on. So I'm hopeful that there will be some interest in actual labor relations over the course of this contract.
Okay, so this industry is complicated. I'm going to ask Adam to help us understand a little bit about all the different parties in it, all the different negotiations, the different structure. It's a really fragmented structure. And then we can ask a little bit later about, once we get that out on the table, about whether that's likely to change at all or whether there's any possibility of it evolving.
So, I should say my knowledge of Hollywood and how Hollywood works is entirely developed. It's a lot like people's knowledge of AI. It's all come about really just in the last few months. Yeah. So my understanding may not be exactly right. But from what I can tell, it strikes me that Hollywood production is a lot like a construction site. And there are different unions that represent different crafts. And each of these unions essentially has its own contract in place. And so the Teamsters are providing the drivers, SAG-AFTRA is providing the talent, so to speak, the actors, right? The WGA is providing the writers.
There's directors.
That's right. The directors who came to their own agreement even before the writers came to theirs. And so it's funny. I always use Hollywood now in class as an example of a gig economy that can actually work. It can actually function quite well. But what struck me as these negotiations came about, and as I was listening to what was going on first with the DGA and then the WGA, now the actors, it seems to me that a traditional craft system may not make as much sense as it once did. And so I wanted to ask Ellen, do you think that there's any impetus or maybe any inclination to actually start thinking in more industrial union terms? In other words, a single industrial union that represents all of these different crafts and trades in the sector?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. I would guess there's a lot of hesitancy to doing that, but I think the important half step is a lot more unity and solidarity. The industry, bargaining in the industry, it's pattern bargaining turned on its head. The employers are united, and the unions have traditionally not been very united. And in our last strike, the Directors Guild went in and negotiated a contract about 6 months ahead of their deadline while writers were on strike, which really kind of undercut the strike. And the deal they made was off the power of striking writers. In this negotiation, the companies had set that up to happen again. Right. They had not made a deal with the directors, who typically go early, and held them off until we were on strike. And they were hoping to use that to set a pattern with the actors and then come back to writers and say, here's the deal you have to take. But what was different this time is, well, we had many writer-specific issues that a Directors Guild agreement could never address, but also the unions were all united. And we've got to continue to work on that process because, the pattern is an issue. It's, the union that first makes the deal the companies insist that that deal is followed by everyone. And we broke pattern on getting a streaming bonus. I believe that the actors may break pattern on minimums and other things. And that's more how it should be, that the power should determine what the agreement is. But I think there's going to be a lot more work building the solidarity across the unions so that the companies can't divide us as they have in the past.
So obviously AI is a new thing, and in addition to trying to build solidarity across the unit, even if you're not able to get to an industrial union structure, are things getting started where there's discussions between the unions about AI and what it means, and sharing kind of ideas or sharing experience? Because that's the other way to think about trying to get more consistency, commonality in how the parties approach bargaining, is prior discussion among them about the critical issues they're facing. And it seems like AI, and then there's other issues too that are really threatening all the parties in this industry.
Yes, definitely. There's ongoing conversations, and the guilds are also trying to coordinate more on a political legislative policy basis, because we can do certain things in the collective bargaining agreement. We can't solve all the issues with AI, and so there's a Washington approach. So yes, there's ongoing conversations about AI and other issues, like, for instance, late pay. Almost no one in this industry is paid on time, and we all have to kind of work to address that.
So we've been covering a lot of ground, and Ellen, you've shared with us a video that the Writers Guild produced about the strike, and why don't we turn to that video, both to just hear from people that were involved in the strike, and then we can continue our discussion after it.
Great.
I just want to take a minute in the middle of all this to thank you all for being here. I know it's there's some sense of optimism on a day like today. I know it's going to be a long haul, that it's going to be a harder day after day, but we can't let up on all of this. Everyone out there says so too.
I want a world in which no AI writes scripts or attempts to. I want a world in which we are fairly compensated.
We got the power. What kind of power? Union power.
We are fighting for the survival of our profession. This is the line in the sand right now.
I think it's much harder today for young writers. Very difficult for them to even get their foot in the door.
That's why I write, to send down the freight elevator and bring as many Latino, Latinx writers as I can with me. But what am I bringing them into? A place where they can't make a fair living?
Goal out here is, number one, to keep people from getting hit by cars. And number two, make sure that the unions that come out and also our members know that we are grateful for their presence. Picketing is not easy.
I don't think the bosses knew what they were up against when they failed to listen to us. And if they didn't know, well, now they know.
WGA fights, we do not fight alone.
We are going to win. And until we do, we're not going anywhere.
So we've got some good questions, so let's turn to those. I'm going to combine two questions. They were both about the losses that were experienced during the strike. Scott asks, how much did your members lose in wages during this strike, and what incremental gains did you get by striking for 5 months that you couldn't have gotten by staying at the table and not losing all those wages? And then there's symmetrically a question by Chris, what are the estimated losses to production companies for the lost full season? So Ellen, answer those as you see fit.
Yeah. Well, our members lost 5 months of work. There was somewhat of a, stockpiling before, so they did some work in advance, and there's obviously a rush back into production. But we really don't look at it that way of what does the strike cost and what do you immediately gain? Because, what writers have won will help not just now, but generations to come. When we went on strike, the companies were offering us almost nothing of what we eventually gained 5 months later. We did when we went on strike, we released what we called a 2-pager, and it was kind of one of our core proposals and where the companies were. And most of their responses were rejected our proposal, refused to make a counter. And when we made a deal, we had substantive gains in each area. So we don't look at it as just a short-term cost, but we do find that the deal is worth hundreds of millions of dollars each year over the next 2.5 years. And the companies have lost hundreds of millions of dollars. It will take time for them to report on the full cost of the strike, but they shut down their business now for 6 months. So that's incredibly problematic for them.
So here's another question related to the strike and its costs. This is asked by Mr. Zhang. Is economic loss the only factor that made studios compromise? Was there political elements? Did the reaction from the viewers, the consumers come into play? Were there something else that drove the studios to ultimately up their offer and come closer to what you wanted? What do you think led to them sort of changing their stance? I mean, there's nothing wrong with saying, oh yeah, they just were suffering ever more and they projected even further loss, but were there other things that came into play?
I think public perception, I think the solidarity in the industry, as I mentioned before, when we went on strike last time, we did not have the support of all unions. And I think the companies, really in a miscalculation of where things are with labor in this country, thought that would happen again and that would help pressure us. And in fact, it was the opposite. Teamsters and IATSE members honored Writers Guild picket lines and shut down production. Mm-hmm. And so it's the loss, but also, they lost in the court of public opinion. I mean, so strongly. So, I think what they ended up agreeing to was largely a result of writer power, that it was about what it would take to get writers back to work, but all of those other things played a role. Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think that Ellen's use of the word miscalculation is so apt, because something I learned, I think, from you, and now I teach my students, is all about why strikes take place. And it seems to me that the fact that management ultimately agreed to what the union asked for at the very beginning, it seems to me then like we could have gotten exactly where we ended up without all of that lost production and all of those lost wages.
It's just a classic case of miscalculation, in this case by management.
Yeah.
You could also argue, by the way, I'll interject a little bit, this, you could look at other industries and argue that's happening in other places. Management maybe thinks they have all the bargaining power they had 20 years ago and 10 years ago and maybe even 5 years ago. They come to the table now, there's a strong labor market. The workforce is especially angry about the effects of the pandemic, the high inflation. Management is still kind of holding to a view about the power they had before, and they've had to raise their offer. We've seen some settlements, John Deere and others, where there's been successive rounds of settlement where management has to continuously raise its offer. Right. Even when the union may initially sort of bring an offer to the membership voted down, and then the management had to sort of up its offer.
I mean, I would also add, To give the writers some credit, I think it's erroneously attributed to Ben Franklin, but this idea of that you never want to get in an argument with somebody that buys ink by the barrel. And nobody buys ink anymore, but now we all have our own printing presses, and every one of these writers had their own printing presses, essentially in the form of Twitter or X or other forms of social media. And not shockingly, they were all really, really great at articulating what was going on and how it was affecting them. And to their credit, I really think it's one way that they were able to really maintain public opinion and public sentiment on their side. One could also argue maybe that the AMPTP made some mistakes along the way, but really the writers deserve some credit for doing what writers do really well.
Is that consistent with what you observed, Ellen, as well?
Yes, I mean, our members did an amazing, job communicating, and I will say for the union, what we are always the most concerned about is maintaining solidarity. It's great that the public supports us, but how do you win a strike? It's because your members are willing to stay on strike. Yeah. And one of the things that was so fantastic about our members on Twitter and other public spaces is that they would immediately debunk leaks and press, like the industry press that would, make some claim that was driven by a studio source, and they would just bat it down and really helped us, kind of keep solidarity. And of course, the public, loves these people. They love actors. They love the people who create this content. But it was so critical to our internal union solidarity.
So we've got some more really good questions coming in. So I'm going to turn to them. Here's a question from John. Does the Guild, this is directed at Ellen, does the Guild have strategic plans over time to include the many artists who work in the entertainment industry who are not covered by current Guild jurisdiction, or put another way, to achieve more sector-wide power and influence, and not just representing their direct membership, but trying to expand that membership and also pursue gains that could spill over even to those that aren't within the union?
Yeah, I think our focus historically has been and will probably still continue to be writers and any writers that aren't covered. For instance, we don't always have the best coverage of game shows or animation writers, which the jurisdiction is shared with IATSE, but our contract is better, and it's a lot of our members who work on uncovered projects. So we'll probably still focus on writing and writers, but it may be. I mean, it's ultimately our leadership and our board who determines the strategic, focus of the organization. So it's always possible. We did try and organize reality television producers a long time back, and we were not successful in doing that, though our colleagues at Writers Guild East have had more success.
Okay, so here's a question that I guess could go to either Ellen or Adam. It speculates about what the management side will do. So it's a question from James. Will management rethink its interest in coalition bargaining, given that there were so many internal divisions on their side and the strike was so costly? Do you think the AMPT may break apart, or something else will happen on that side?
Can I add a question to that, and then give it to Ellen?
Yeah.
So did you guys make any efforts to try to drive a wedge between them?
Yes, and we were public in saying we were open to making a deal individually with some of the bigger companies. Not doing, SAG has made these interim agreements, not that, because we've had experience with doing that and it's not successful. But if a Warner Brothers or a Disney wanted to make a deal that would set the pattern, we were open to that. I think that organization has perhaps outlived its usefulness. I certainly know there are companies within it that were very frustrated with the process. But it's also been incredibly successful for them in controlling labor costs. So I think there will be some thinking. I don't know exactly what will happen. And obviously the Teamsters and IATSE will negotiate next year, and they feel pretty strongly that it's a broken system, and it could be facing strikes again next year if they don't learn any lessons from this year.
So here's another question that brings us back to the issue of AI. What plan does the WGA have to further protect writers from artificial intelligence? Because currently under the court decision, AI-generated content is not copyrightable, and it's not protected by U.S. copyright law. I gather some of that was addressed in your agreement, but maybe there's other things as well that you're hoping to gain in the future.
Yeah. The area that we will continue to work on specifically is training. And that is because the companies that have scraped books and our members' scripts from the internet are not signatory to our agreement. So we don't have a contractual relationship with them. But our view is they should not have been able to do that. There's a debate under copyright law if it's fair use. We don't think that's the case. So we're involved in Copyright Office is doing a notice of inquiry about what it needs to do. There may be legislation. That's obviously very important because we just don't think it's acceptable for these companies to have taken writers' work to develop a system that could be used to, replace them.
This strikes me as an area where there could be a lot of agreement and really some cooperation between the studios and the unions.
Right, you would think so. The companies are, they
right.
want to copyright.
They also want to own their copyrights.
They want to get the revenue from it.
Right.
Exactly. Yes, and I'm hopeful for that they too should not be okay with Microsoft or Google having taken their entire, intellectual property library and using it.
Right. So here's a nice question that asks us to think about international matters. It's from Kate. Was there any engagement from writers' entertainment unions from other countries, and or are there plans to do more on issues such as AI through global campaigns, coordination, communication, joint discussion? What's going on that international front?
Yeah, 100% yes. The Writers Guild is part of an organization. It's an international organization of writers' guilds that supported us. We all have an agreement not to take each other's work. That includes guilds in Canada, the UK, Germany, France, India, New Zealand, Ireland, Israel. And so we are all working together on issues. AI is obviously a big one. These unions take a lot of direction from what we're able to achieve. And they were very supportive. We had an international day of solidarity where the unions across the world did demonstrations or sort of actions on social media to support writers. And it's very important because there is sometimes some concern that the companies will try and go to writers outside of the U.S. to do work when we're on strike.
You mentioned interim deals a few minutes ago, Ellen, and I remember back in 2007 there were a few interim deals that the WGA.
You mean interim during the life of a contract, or what do you mean by an interim deal?
During the strike.
Oh, during the strike.
And so, for example, I remember that you were allowing your writers to work, I think, on Letterman, and there may have been a few other programs. Tell us why it is that you didn't want to go that route this time around.
Yeah. So what we learned from the 07 strike in doing that was, one, it didn't change the dynamics. It was not a successful strategy in terms of forcing the larger companies to make a deal. It didn't put sufficient pressure. It's also, divisive among the membership. Some people get to go back to work while others don't. And so we were very clear at the outset of our negotiation that we were not going to do that. And it was really important for late night. You mentioned Letterman. So Letterman had his own company. We made a deal with him. And then all the other late night hosts were kind of pressured to come back, but without an agreement. And this time in advance, because we were not going to do that, all of the hosts agreed that they wouldn't come back, and they didn't. And actually, they had a podcast that helped fund money for their staffs, but they were incredibly supportive and never went back until the strike was over.
So we have another interesting question. It's from a viewer. I'll rephrase it a little bit, but basically this person's saying sort of, How does this settlement of this strike benefit the viewers, who are interested in watching, good new shows, good new content? How would you answer that concern of a viewer? What's in it for them?
I really do think writers went on strike to save the profession and the industry, and they feel that they have done that. And what has happened over the last number of years, because of the way writing has changed, people feel like perhaps, the best stories haven't been told. And that's not to denigrate any of the work that the members have done, but that quality has suffered a little bit because of the squeeze on writing. And so by insisting that, writing is placed back in its proper place, there's just a feeling that the storytelling will get to be better because of more writer involvement. So hopefully people will see that on the screen.
What would you say as an analyst of this sort of strike? How do the viewers benefit from what's happening here?
Well, that's what I was thinking. Storytelling is always getting better and better. And I know I've been encouraging my students in particular to really get down and dirty with ChatGPT and other large language models. And there's a lot they do really well and that I actually think could be really useful pedagogically. But if you ask ChatGPT to tell you a story, or to, God forbid, you ask it to tell you a joke, the difference in quality is quite obvious. Yeah. And I think I think viewers could very much tell if they were watching something that was written by ChatGPT.
Yeah, but again, I think it's also interesting, I think you both agree, that this is not a situation where the union is being Luddite. It's not saying we reject the technology. They're saying let's find ways to use it in a healthy way, right, as a complement to the creativity of the writer, but also to make sure the writers get appropriate credit, for their role, and also influence the process. So they're involved in how the technology is going to be used in the future. They want to have a say, as well as not necessarily saying, of course everything about the technology is bad and we're going to block it. They're trying to, just like you're telling your students, let's use it in a healthy way.
But, I've been telling my students to try to use it to make their writing more crisp, to try to make it punchier. And frankly, I've been doing the same thing. I also use it for brainstorming. That said, I'm not a great writer compared to the people that are in Ellen's rank and file. So my question for Ellen would be, I understand that the contract very much allows them to use it if their employer allows it. Do they look at it the same way I do, or do they just look at it as complete anathema?
Well, I'm sure our membership, the views on it run the gamut. There are certainly people who are interested in using it, and then there are members who have very strong reaction to it, like David Simon, who's the creator of The Wire and was on our negotiating committee. Has had some choice words about if he ever had to do it, and feels very strongly. So there are definitely a lot of people who just think it has no place, and then other people who are willing to try it out. And I think what we've negotiated kind of allows for both of those things.
So Ellen, what didn't you get in through this negotiations that you hope to get one way or another, either through informal discussion or through future negotiations?
Well, I think there's always, I think future negotiations will focus on improvements on sort of the baseline that we've set, and we just need time to see how it all is going to play out and where we need to improve. The one thing that we didn't get that I would have liked us to was actually a late addition. We made the demand in August when we were on strike, and it was the right to honor a picket line of another union. And it wasn't an initial proposal we had made before going on strike, but because when we went on strike, so many unions honored our picket lines, our members felt it was very important and they want to do the same thing. We weren't able to achieve it, and I think the other unions, Teamsters in particular, understood they'd rather have writers back to work than still striking for that right. But that's something that was important to our members for the solidarity that they experienced.
So I think you've just answered this question, but I'll just, ask it more explicitly. It was offered by Andy. Is there now a clause in the Writers Guild contract that would penalize writers who picket with other unions, like IATSE, next year? And I think your answer is no, but maybe I'm interpreting it wrong.
Well, I mean, writers, we can, of course, go out and support and walk in solidarity with on any picket line. We don't have the right to not cross the picket line and not go to work if we're required to do that. But I will say, even though we didn't get it, a lot of writers, when they went back to rooms while SAG is still on strike, negotiated to have the room off-site, off of the studio lot, so that they wouldn't actually cross the picket line.
Uh-huh. So here's a question for Adam, though I suppose I could chime in too, but it's from Lori. She says, as professors, what have you learned from this strike that you'll educate students on? What is it about this strike that's really worth teaching about?
Well, so there are a few things, some of which I've touched on. I mean, what I love about this strike is that in so many ways, it raises issues that are not new issues. They're actually old issues. But first of all, it modernizes them because we're talking about creatives and we're talking about white-collar workers. And so often, when I try to give my students examples, they will say, oh, well, that's an industry that hasn't operated in the U.S. in years. Right. And if we're talking about textiles, that's true, right? But no, I can say, no, these are jobs that many of you aspire to, right? And these are the same kinds of issues that we could have discussed in the 1970s. These are issues around technological change. These are issues around staffing ratios. These are issues around work rules. And yet they will impact you as well and people in jobs like yours. So that's why I get excited about this, is it gives me a really modern example and very much a living example. And so it can operate alongside the brands that are getting a lot of attention now in strike, in the labor relations world. Folks are focusing now on Starbucks and folks are focusing on Amazon. And again, for my students, it's great because these are companies that
they can relate to.
They interact with as customers. And so here, again, like this is content that they consume, and this is even a sector that they could imagine in some cases actually wanting to work in. So it's the relevance of it that gets me really excited.
And just to elaborate on you, when you say this new technology matters, it's an old issue. It seems to me, someone who's been teaching about labor relations for far too long, that it raises sort of two basic issues, and Ellen and you, Adam, have covered this in some of your remarks. One is when technological change is introduced, who gets the benefit? Who gets what share of the benefit? What share do workers get if they participate in the introduction of new technology, right? Or are they just affected by it through reductions in the demand for labor and the number of workers working? And then the other issue is about process. Do workers have a say? Do they get to influence how technology is used, when it's used, how it affects their job? Ellen's raised the issue, does it lead to more training? Does it lead to the development of their career path? And again, you could raise that about almost any new technology, but this is a very, as you say, a very contemporary example that people can relate to.
And I now sort of surreptitiously teach even some non-ILR students at Cornell about labor relations. I do it through a tech course that I teach called Technological Change at Work. And so I have the opportunity to teach engineers and students in our Arts and Sciences College who, if you ask them, they would say they don't have much of an interest in labor relations. But when you start talking about technology, you can talk about what is the technology being used for? Is it being used to automate work? Is it used to automate work out of existence? Or is it actually being used to augment the nature of what workers do, to make workers more productive and to actually increase the amount of value that they can create for the employer? So these are the kinds of conversations we can have now, and I love that I can turn to the writers for these examples.
So I'll direct the next one to Adam, but I'm also curious what Ellen thinks, and that's what's going to be the influence of the specific gains that the writers won in this round in other industries? Is it going to affect in many industries the way AI is used or other technologies are used, or is it just another example, we were mentioning a little bit about that, of where management has to be more realistic as to what the worker power is now, and they're going to have to adjust their expectations and their offers? How do you think it's going to affect labor relations in other industries?
I mean, at this point, I think it can only be good for workers, and in particular, it can only be good for workers to see labor unions in the news doing what labor unions do best and what they're meant to do, which is to improve outcomes, not only for workers, but I really think for the economy as a whole. And so one of the earlier questioners, one of the folks who wrote in, asked about whether or not it was worth it, asked Ellen whether or not the workers will be able to make this up. In a sense, Ellen has to think about her members, right? That's who she works for. We can think a little bit more broadly, and I would argue that, what Ellen and her folks did has benefits beyond just those people that employ her and that she was really working for. I think the economy as a whole is really going to benefit from much of the work that Ellen put in, and even more importantly, all of those folks that pounded the pavement for close to 6 months.
So, Ellen, what's your hope about how this settlement will influence labor relations in other industries?
Well, I think it's a big picture, exercising your power, being willing to fight. This summer was deemed hot labor summer, and in Los Angeles, writers and actors were on the picket line, and then we went and picketed with hotel workers who are still on strike. City workers went on strike, and so there's just a feeling of, the action compounds. People look at others fighting and feel the ability to do that, and we are buoyed by the UAW going out on strike and winning, and so I just hope that continues, and that will help carry that for our own industry into next year, into the negotiations for the Teamsters and the crafts, and just keep it going, because labor needs to be revitalized. I mean, my entire career from when I was at ILR till now has been the decline of labor, and I'd really like to be a part of changing that narrative.
So, Ellen, we've covered a lot of ground. Are there things that we didn't get to that you think are really important about the negotiations, the settlement, or its implications?
I think it's just what the title was, which is really, worker militancy. I always tell my members who, thank me, but I say to them, the reason we were able to negotiate the contract that we did was because you just never let up. You were out there. It's not a given to go on strike for 148 days and be as strong as you are. And it's just because they were committed and willing to fight and would have kept going if the deal wasn't there. Mm-hmm. And so to me, that's just the lesson. And obviously for the union, it's, 15 years of work to get to this point. But it all comes down to what the members are willing to fight for. So
we've addressed a lot of key issues. I've learned a lot myself, and I hope the viewers have too. I want to thank Ellen so much for participating. I want to thank Adam. Ellen's mentioned the phrase worker militancy. I want to remind the viewers this is the first of a series of webinars on worker militancy. We're planning to have a webinar focused on the UAW strike and its consequences. We're talking about potentially having one later about the healthcare strikes at Kaiser Permanente and other places, because as Ellen's mentioned, this is an era of increased worker militancy, and each sector is a little bit different from the other, even though they have some commonalities. So thanks again to you, and thanks to the audience for participating and providing us with some really good questions. Take care.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks, Harry.